Hi, this is Jeff Hawkins with Numenta. A week ago, on October 15th, 2018, I gave a talk in the Maastricht, Netherlands at the European Human Brain Project Summit. It was a keynote address at a major neuroscience conference, and our intention was to record that talk, but that didn't happen, so we're recreating the talk in this screencast. It was an honor to speak at this event. The Human Brain Project is a large 10-year effort by the European Union to understand the human brain. And I was invited to speak because we were coming up with a new theory about how the human neocortex works. And it was a great coincidence because we've been working very hard on writing a paper on this new theory, and that paper became available to view on a preprint server by arXiv just 2 days before my talk, and my talk followed that paper. So that's the context for what we're about to see here. Great. So the title of my talk is Location, a Framework for Intelligence and Cortical Computation. So let's just jump right into it. This gentleman here is Francis Crick. And he is, of course, famous for being one of the co-discoverers of the double helix structure of the DNA molecule. And he won a Nobel Prize for that. The latter part of his life, he spent thinking about the other big problem, which is human intelligence and the brain. And in 1979, he wrote this essay called Thinking About the Brain, which had a huge impact on my life. And this was a critical essay. He said, you know what, people have been studying the brain for a long time, even back in 1979, and they had amassed a huge amount of data. But he said, in spite of this accumulation of detailed knowledge, how the human brain works is still profoundly mysterious. He said, we were clearly going to get more data over the time, and we're going to come up with new techniques for measuring and understanding how the brain works. He says, but it may not matter because we're just not thinking about the problem correctly. He said, to understand the brain, we need new ways of thinking about it. More experimental data will not be sufficient. So this is a real sort of wake-up call for neuroscience. We're just not going about this in the right way. And then here's a longer quote I want to read to you. He says, what is conspicuously lacking is a framework of ideas within which to interpret all these different approaches. It is not that most neurologists do not have some general concept of what is going on. The trouble is the concept is not precisely formulated. Touch it and it crumbles. Ouch. He's being really critical here. He's saying, you know, people act as if we understand the brain or what's going on, but he says we really don't. And to me, when I read this article, I said, wow, that's incredible. I want to spend my life working on that. And that's what we do at Numenta. We work on this, developing this framework for understanding the neocortex. Now, that we think about the human brain, the neocortex is about 75% of the volume of the brain. That's a picture of the neocortex right here. The other 25% consists of like the brainstem and the spinal cord and the cerebellum, and it's like a post that sticks up inside of the neocortex. The old part of the brain, the old 25% of the brain, did things like autonomic control of breathing and heart rate, reflex reactions, maybe even running and walking are controlled by that, emotions. But when we think about things, everything we think about intelligence, it's really the neocortex. Everything about perception and language and thought and planning, all your conscious perceptions are all in the neocortex. And even today, how it works is still a mystery. It's also, in my opinion, the most important scientific problem of all time. Not only are we as humans really basically a neocortex, and all of our issues and problems in society are related to our brains, it is how we think, it is all of our arts and sciences, and I believe understanding the neocortex will be important for the long-term survival of our species. I'll get back to that more at the end of my talk. So here's my talk outline. I'm going to go through some background material because I can't assume everybody knows a lot of neuroscience. I want to get you up to speed where we are. And then I'm going to introduce this new framework for intelligence and cortical computation. And then at the end of the talk, I'll talk about some of the implications for the new theory. All right, let's go into some background material. Here's a model of the neocortex. It's a dinner napkin. And if you could take a neocortex out of your head and iron it flat, it would be about this big and about this thick, a little bit thicker. It's about 1,500 square centimeters in area and 2.5 millimeters thick. In this tissue, in this neocortex, there's somewhere between 15 and 20 billion neurons. Now, one of the tenets of neuroscience is that every perception and every thought and everything you've ever occurred to you and perceived is basically the activity of neurons. So some of these neurons are active, most of them are inactive at any point in time, and the ones that are inactive represent your current thoughts and perceptions. The neurons are connected together. There are thousands of synapses or connections between each neuron. So there's somewhere between 50 and 100 trillion synapses in the neocortex. And the second tenet of neuroscience is those synapses contain all the knowledge you have about the world. So everything you know, everything you've ever learned is stored in those connections. Now, if you look at the surface of the neocortex, it's very uniform. You don't see any demarcations. But we now know that different areas do different things. This was first discovered when people had trauma and they had an injury in one spot and they said, oh, they can no longer see, or they can't do language, or they can't think about certain types of things. But we now have mapped out the neocortex in great detail. We know that these different regions are connected to each other with bundles of nerve fibers through the white matter. And some of those regions are assigned to different things. So let's just talk about that and go back to the slides here. So now we have, here I've shown some of those regions. I've highlighted in blue some visual regions, some auditory regions, some somatosensory regions. Those are multiple regions in those blue highlighted areas. You see there's a large part of the cortex you can't easily associate with vision, auditory, and somatic input. And the basic way people think about this is the following. They say, oh, the input comes in from some sensory organ such as the retina. It projects to the first visual region in the back of your brain. And that visual region extracts some sort of simple features, and then those simple features are passed to the next region, which extracts some complex features, which projects to the next region. And after a few of these, you end up with some sort of object representation. This is people believe the same basic thing is happening in different modalities, such as touch, and so your skin projects to the somatosensory regions, and a similar type of process. And somehow, in these, most of the neocortex, there's some sort of multimodal associations, multiple modal objects, and so on. This is the basic idea of how many people think about the brain today. It's actually not really true, and I'll get to that in a moment. When you actually look at map out how regions of the brains connect to each other, and this has been done, when the first real great map was done in 1991 by two people, Feldman and Van Essen, this is what they reported. This picture on the left shows each of those little rectangles is a region of a macaque monkey's neocortex, and it's basically showing the somatosensory regions on the left and the visual regions on the right. And the lines are bundles of nerve fibers, millions of nerve fibers that are going between each of these regions. And you can see it's very complicated. There's connections going all over the place, and there's parallel horizontal connections and parallel regions, and there's level skipping going on. So we can start, first of all, just say this is a very complex structure. It's not a simple flow chart like in the upper right. It's certainly not strictly hierarchical. In fact, in 1991, they reported that 40% of all possible connections between regions exist, which is much greater than you would get in a hierarchy. And now we know that number is much, much higher. With new techniques, we know that there's a far greater connectivity. So that's kind of confusing. Now, the strange thing about it is no matter where you look in the neocortex, if you look at any one of these regions, the local circuitry anywhere is remarkably the same. So you have all these regions doing different things connected in this crazy way, but then every region looks like it's doing the same thing. This was first noted by perhaps the most famous neuroscientist of all time, Vernon MalCastle, a Spaniard. And right around in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he started mapping out all different types of parts of the brain. They had just discovered these staining techniques where you could take a bunch of neural tissue and it would stain just some of the neurons. And this was important because if you stained all the neurons, it would be big black mass. So by staining some of the neurons, they could start seeing what they look like. So here on the left of the picture here is a slice of the neocortex. You see it's 2.5 millimeters thick. And this stain highlights the cell bodies, so the neuron bodies. And you can see they have different shapes, they have different sizes, and they have different packing densities. And they started noticing that they appeared to be layers. And so they started saying, oh, it looks like there's 6 layers of neurons in the neocortex. And this looked the same everywhere. Then the image on the right is a different stain that not only stains the cell body, but it stains the dendrites and the axons that are coming out of the cell. So now you can see how they're connected. And you can see there's a lot of vertical connectivity going on across the layers, and some layers have more horizontal connectivity. So for the last 120 years, many neuroscientists have been mapping out what these circuits look like, what these neurons look like, how they're connected together. It's an incredibly rich field of data. People like ourselves who are theorists, we create models from this. So we build pictures like this where we're looking at the different cell layers and trying to figure out how they connect together and what they're doing and the different types of connections between them. We can just summarize some of this. First, we could say there are dozens of neuron types in the neocortex. They are organized in layers. How many layers you get depends on how you measure them. And you could say 6 to 10, depending on which way you break them apart. But there are prototypical projections across layers, meaning that everywhere you look, the same type of connections, and the information basically goes vertically. It comes in one layer, and it goes up, and it goes down, and back and forth across the layers. There are horizontal connections, but they're more limited, and they only come from certain layers. Another thing that was discovered was that all regions in the neocortex have a motor output, and I've shown that here, labeled this one of the green arrows coming back out. And this is surprising. You'd think you might have heard that there's a motor section of the neocortex, but reality is that all parts of the neocortex are motor cortex. And so you say, well, what would the visual cortex have to say about movement? Well, it turns out that the regions in the visual cortex project to an old part of the brain that moves the eyes. And the regions in the auditory cortex projects to a part of the brain that orients the head. And so when you're listening or when you're seeing, it's an active sense. You don't just see by getting input from the eyes. You see by moving the eyes and getting inputs. And that's how the cortex works as a general principle. And then, of course, as I've said already, that every part of the neocortex has similar circuits. Now, there are variations. And so people point out, oh, this part of the cortex is a little bit more of this, and this part of the cortex is a little bit less of that. And so there are variations that are going on, but there's this complex common circuitry everywhere. And so there's something fundamental going on everywhere in the neocortex, and it's complex. The first person who really made some sense of this was a gentleman named Vernon MalCastle. And he had this huge idea. By the way, he is like one of the fathers of neuroscience, and he was really the guy who has some of the most elegant writings about the neocortex. He was at Johns Hopkins. And he had this big idea. In 1978, he published a monograph. And in that monograph, he made the following claims. He says, well, look, the reason that all areas of the neocortex look the same is because they perform the same basic function. They're all doing the same thing. And what makes one region a visual cortex, another region an auditory region, is what it's connected to. Literally, he's saying you could take a part of the neocortex and stick an auditory nerve into it, and it would become auditory cortex. Or you could take, and if you stuck a visual nerve into it, it would become visual cortex. And then, which is an amazing idea. And then he said, a small area of the cortex, about a 1 millimeter square area, which he called the cortical column, is the unit of replication and contains this sort of common cortical algorithm. He chose a millimeter square because in that square millimeter you would have all the different cell types, all the different connections, all the different physiological response properties. It wasn't that this cortical column is a physical thing. It was that it was a small enough unit that contained everything. We sometimes make pictures like this to illustrate this. So here we can imagine a slice of the neocortex, and you're looking at the neocortical sheet, and we're showing these individual columns packed in there. In a human, there'd be 150,000 of these columns. Now again, they're not physical like this. If you actually look at the cortex, with just a few exceptions, you wouldn't see this, but this is the way to think about it, and this is the way a lot of neuroscientists do, is what this column looks like. Now, MalCastle's idea was one of the biggest ideas ever in science. I put it right up there with Darwin. Darwin said that we have this tremendous diversity of life, and all of it comes about because of a single algorithm repeated over and over again. And MalCastle is saying we have this tremendous diversity of intelligence. And everything we think about of intelligence, whether it's language or music or arts or physics and mathematics, is all based on a single algorithm. It's an incredible idea. It's so incredible that many neuroscientists today have trouble dealing with it. It's like they don't know how to interpret it, what to do about it. But it's clearly true, and it should be a foundation of all neocortical theory. Okay, so the next question I want to address is, what does the neocortex do? And over the years, people propose different ways of looking about it, but I and other neuroscientists, many of us have come up with this perspective. It's a thing about the neocortex. What it does is it learns a model of the world. So when you're born, you don't know about the world. You don't know about buildings and cars and people. You don't know about trees. You don't know about computers. You don't know about everything. And you don't know any languages. You don't know any words. You have to learn all of this. And so you have to learn this model of the world. And in your cortex, you have a model of the world. And when you interact with that model, you'll see it makes predictions. So let's talk about what does that model consist of. There's thousands and thousands of things you know. You know how they look, how they feel, and how they sound. Objects in the world that you interact with every day. You know where these objects are located relative to other objects. So I'm sitting here, I'm in a room and I see a door and a screen and a floor and a table and chairs. These things I recognize, but they also have relationship to each other, and I would not expect to see the door on the ceiling or on the floor. I know how objects behave. So, for example, a door has hinges and it can open and close and it has a latch that goes up and down. Or my computer has all kinds of behaviors that it changes as I interact with it. And we do this, we also learn this for both physical and abstract objects. So I can model physical things that are in front of me, but I also model abstract concepts, maybe like democracy or places I've never been to, and yet I still have models of them. And then finally, it's a predictive model. So you have this model in your cortex, and it's constantly making predictions about what's going to happen next. And this is its value. Now, it makes predictions at all levels. So even every time I touch something, I have a prediction of what I'm going to feel. And every time I move my eyes, I have a prediction of what I'm going to see, even if I'm not consciously aware of this. But I also can make predictions about long-term things. So if I'm trying to apply to get a grant for my science, I might say, should I apply early or late? Or should I use this language or that language to improve my chances of getting accepted? So we're trying to predict the outcomes of our actions all the time. I wrote an entire book about how the cortex builds predictive models. It's called On Intelligence. So this is what the brain does. This is an incredibly complex model of the world that is stored in your neocortex, and we want to understand how it happens. So the question we want to now is how does the neocortex learn this model using the circuitry that we've talked about? So now we can switch to our new framework for this. So I'm going to start with a thought experiment. This occurred to us a couple of years ago, and it was a real revelation, and sort of a bunch of things came out of this thought experiment. We were asking how it is I can predict what I'm going to feel when I touch an object, such as a cup like this. And it sounds simple, but it's a very complex question to answer. And what we realized was the following. I asked myself, well, what does the brain need to know? What does the cortex need to know to predict what I'm going to feel when I move my finger to a new location and place it down on top of the cup? So I'm going to touch the rim of the cup here. And I can imagine what I'm going to feel before I feel it. The cortex needs to know several things. It needs to know that it's touching a coffee cup. It needs to know, it says, oh, I know what this object is, because that's a requirement to know. It also needs to know where the finger is going to be on the cup after the finger comes down. If I move the finger in a different direction, I'll touch something else, and I'll feel something different. So it has to know where it's going to be, and it needs to know what object it's touching. Now, if my finger is first on the side of the cup, and I'm about to move it, I have to know where it is originally and where it will be based on a movement. So essentially saying, well, okay, where's my finger now? Where will it be after I move? And then I can make a prediction about the cup. Now, this is a location, where it is a location relative to the cup. It's not relative to my body. The same thing would occur if the cup was at a different angle and so on. So the cortex needs to know a location in the reference frame of the cup. It's kind of hard to imagine it would do that, but it must need to know that. Now, if you realize that when you touch the cup with multiple fingers at the same time or with your hand, all parts of your skin are making the same type of predictions. So my different fingers are touching different parts of the cup, but each one independently and simultaneously predicting what it's going to feel, and therefore each part of my skin has to know where it is relative to this cup. There isn't a single location. Every part of my input has to have a location. And so this tells us that in the primary sensory cortex, in the neocortex, in this case touch, but the same is going to happen in vision and audition, there has to be a representation in the neural tissue of the location on the object that I'm touching. This is a really interesting idea, and we ran with it. Okay, back to the slides. A year ago, just about a year ago, we published our first paper on this idea, and it was called, the title of the paper was "The Theory of How Columns in the Neocortex Enable Learning the Structure of the World." And I'll give you just a brief synopsis of what's in that paper. We argued that a single column in the cortex is, say, receiving input from the tip of your finger, is able to learn complete models of objects. How does it do that? I mentioned it had to have a location signal, which I'm illustrating here in blue. So we have an input coming from the finger, and you have another input coming from a different layer in the cortex, which we believe is in layer 6, and that represents the location of the input relative to the object. So now I have two things. I have the actual sensation coming from the finger, and I have the location on the object. These arrive in layer 4. This is well-known anatomy. And so now if I think about that, I say, okay, I know the sense and where it is, and if I move my finger multiple times, I can basically build up a model of the object, what the different features are at different locations. And we propose that that's being assembled in an upper layer, layer 2, 3. This object layer is a stable representation, like this would represent the coffee cup. It's the stable representation, meaning as I move my finger, the input changes and the location changes, but the representation in the output layer is stable. So I associate a set of features and locations with an object. We then went on to show that what would happen if I had multiple columns at the same time. So imagine I have 3 fingers touching the cup at the same time. Each one is sensing a different location, has a different input. Each one on its own would not be able to determine what the object is. But they can by voting, meaning at this object layer, they can all be uncertain, say, well, I don't really know what this is. It could be A, B, and C, and the other one says this could be B, C, and D, and the other one says this could be B, X, and Q, and they say, oh, it must be B, the coffee cup. We modeled this, we showed simulations on this using realistic neurons, we showed the capacity of the system, but the basic idea is if you only had like one sensory, like one finger, imagine I was asking you to recognize an object by putting your finger in a black box, and you touch, with one touch, you almost certainly couldn't recognize what the object is, but if I can touch, I'd have to move my finger in multiple locations, but if I can grab it with my whole hand at once, I can usually get it in a single sense. So multiple columns can infer objects in a single sensation by voting on object identity. This is touch, but you should realize that the same thing is going on in vision and other sensory modalities. When you think about the eyeball or the retina, it's not a single thing. It's like the skin. It's a set of sensory organs arranged on the retina, and each one of those is projecting to a column. And each one, it's like the cortex visual cortex doesn't look at an image. It looks at lots of little pieces of it, just like when you get the inputs from your fingers. So the same basic structure works in all modalities. We had a big question, though. Like, we proposed that this location representation is in layer 6, in one of these lower layers, but how could that be? Where could it come from? What does it look like? How would the brain know a location, and what does it mean to know a location on an object? In this paper, we didn't answer that question. We left it as a question, but we suggested where to look to find the answer, and that turned out to be correct. What we suggested is we should look in something called the entorhinal cortex. Now, what's going on in the entorhinal cortex? You may have heard of these. In the entorhinal cortex, there's some things called grid cells. Here I have a picture of a rodent and a human, and it shows these two older and smaller brain structures. They're not part of the neocortex, called the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex. You can see in the human, they're like the size of maybe your pinky. They're sort of wrapped around on the inside towards the older part of the brain. Grid cells are a very hot topic. A lot of people have been studying them. Nobel Prizes have been awarded for them. And what they do is they represent the location of your body relative to an environment. So, and we have them too. So let me just give you what do I mean by representing the location of your body relative to the environment? So I'm in a room right now, and I have a sense of where I am in the room. And remember, when you have a sense for something, there's cells that are representing that. That's the grid cells in my entorhinal cortex. And they're representing where I am. And even if I close my eyes and I take a couple steps over here, I have a different perception of where I am in the room. I know now that the stool is further away, that window is further away. If I step back here, I know I'm closer to it again. So this sense of where I am is actually these grid cells in the entorhinal cortex. And they're updating as I move. And because they update, even if I'm not looking at anything, then you know that they're updated by my movement themselves. I don't need a sensory input to tell me this. The brain says, if you moved, I know you're in a different location. I'm going to represent the location differently. Okay, let's go back to this. So these grid cells represent the location of the body relative to an environment. The big idea we have is that grid cells also exist in the neocortex, that they were preserved in evolutionary time, but now they're used for something different. The cortical grid cells represent the location of a sensory input relative to the objects you're sensing. And I'll go into this more in detail. First of all, I need to tell you how grid cells work. Now, this is complicated, and if I lose you on this, we'll come back and you don't need all the details about this, but the details are important and they're interesting. So let's just talk about some basic things about grid cells, how they represent location. Typically, this is done with a rodent, such as a rat or a mouse. And here we have a rodent walking around in a room. And if I were to stick a probe into one of the grid cells in its entorhinal cortex and say, well, when does that grid cell become active? When does it fire? You would see that it becomes active at different locations in this environment. Whenever the rodent is in one of those red spots, that cell becomes active. And when it's not in a red spot, it's relatively inactive. And this occurs no matter how the animal moves on their own. That's where the term grid comes from, because it's a sort of a grid-like pattern in the room where this cell becomes active. Now, we know, as I just mentioned a moment ago, that the grid cell's activity is updated by motor commands, because this even happens in the dark. If the animal is moving around in the dark, it doesn't have to see anything for these grid cells to say, hey, we're in a new location now. Now, this isn't very useful to knowing exactly where you are, because it could be any one of those spots. If we then probe the next cell over, one right close to the first one, a different grid cell, we might see that it becomes active in these blue areas. And so you can see there are very similar spacing and similar tiling going on here. It just represents one little further over. In fact, there are grid cells that represent every spot in this room, but they're all sort of the same tiled. So grid cells on themselves can tell you something about where you are in the room, but they can't represent a unique location. So how does the brain get around that? The basic way we believe, and other people believe it gets around, is as follows. Imagine I had two grid cell modules, meaning two sets of grid cells, module 1 and module 2, and they differ slightly. They might differ in their spacing of where the firing fields are, and they might differ in their orientation relative to the room. Now, if I wanted to know where I am in the room, if I looked at the cells in module 1, I might say, well, I could be at any one of those red spots because that cell's active. And if I looked at module 2, I could say I could be any one of those green spots because that's where this cell is active. But if I look at the two modules together and say which two cells are firing, one from module 1 and one from module 2, it turns out you end up with a unique location. And so you can now say, by looking at those two cells together, aha, I know where I am, because that's the only place where these two cells are, when those two cells are active, it must be at this location. And if you have a set of modules, the number of locations you can identify uniquely grows exponentially with the set of modules. And so you can create a very, very large sort of space of locations in the world. And so now the animal can know exactly where it is. One of the things that I won't explain it in more detail, but to state, is that the representation location is different than the kind of thing you learned in high school. You know, it's not like X, Y, and Z. And in this case, the location, meaning which cells are firing, which grid cells are firing, is unique to the position in the room and to the room. So if I know my location, I know where I am in the room and I know what room I'm in. They're unique in all of the world. So it's a very unique thing. Okay, that's the basics about grid cells. Now, the theory is, and this is, many people study this, is that the entorhinal cortex use grid cells to learn and map environments. Like, how do I learn the spaces in the rooms I'm in? And we do the same thing, too. And so the grid cells represent your location of the body relative to the room. I show two rooms here that are different in the sense that I've shown one having a green wall and one having a blue wall. And so the rat or the rodent will see these as different rooms, even though they're the same size. And I've marked three different locations, or labeled three different locations in each room. In room 1, I've labeled location A, B, and C. In room 2, I've labeled location D, E, and F. But remember, every location in the room has a unique representation. And as the animal moves, these location representations change. Notice if I go from A to B to C, or if I go directly from A to C, I'm always going to get the C. This is called path integration. So no matter how I get there, you're always going to get the same location. Now, if you think about this, since each of these, all these locations are unique to the room, that a room can be defined as a location space. Of all the possible location representations in the world, there's a unique set that are assigned to each of these rooms. And so we can think about a room having this location space. Even if the animal's never been to some corner of the room, it still has a representation for that location. Now, what we're proposing is the following. The neocortex does something very similar. But instead of the animal, your body moving around in the room, it's your sensory patches or your sensory organs moving relative to objects in the world. So in the cortex, the grid cells represent the location of a sensor input relative to an object. In this case, where my finger is relative to the pen or relative to the coffee cup. I've labeled 3 locations on the cup, X, Y, and Z. I've labeled 4 locations relative to the pen. And as you move your finger, the cortex updates its location relative to those objects. Notice if I go from V to T and I go through location W. W is not on the pen, but it's still in the location space of the pen. So the location space is bigger than just the object. The object is contained in this location space. And so the cortex would be tracking where that finger is as it moves. So every object in the world now has its own unique location space. And this is the key to understanding how the cortex models the world. Objects have their own location spaces, and we have to start thinking along those lines. So now we go back to the drawing I showed you earlier, and I said, well, we didn't know how the location relative to the object was represented. We now believe that there are grid cell modules in each cortical column. I showed those by these little green rectangles here. And so they provide the mechanism for representing the location. And everything we've learned about grid cells now applies to the cortex as well. We had another paper which is just posted just a few weeks ago, which talks about the mechanisms between how these grid cells in layer 6 and layer 4 actually interact. It's a more detailed paper, subset of this overall theory, and that's mentioned Lewis et al. So let's review our proposal so far. We propose that the grid cells exist in every cortical column, and they represent the location of the input to the column relative to the object being sensed. Each column is now able to learn complete models of objects because it knows these location signals. And the objects in the world have their own unique location space. So once we understood this, there's a whole series of other problems that we've been puzzling over for years that became clear how to solve them. I'll just go through a few of them. And as I mentioned here, this basically defines a location-based framework for understanding the neocortex. So let's talk about one of these things. One of these things is compositional structure. Everything in the world is composed of other things. So a door, imagine a door, it has panels and a shape, but it also has a handle that goes up and down or rotates. It also got a little hasp that goes in and out. It also has hinges, and the hinges have pins and the screws and so on. So every object in the world is like this. Cars consist of other things. And so the cortex has to learn objects as composed of other objects arranged in particular ways. The example we're going to use again is our coffee cup. In this case, we have the coffee cup with the Numenta logo on it. The cup is a previously learned object. I mean, I know coffee cups, and the logo is a previously learned object. I've seen that elsewhere in the world, and I'm trying to learn a new thing, a new composition, which is the cup with the logo. I've never seen that combination before, and I want to learn it very quickly and efficiently. I don't want to have to relearn the cup or relearn the logo. I want to be able to say, here's a new object, consists of something I already know and something else I already know, bingo, it's done. Here's the new object, and I basically want to carry on all knowledge associated with the logo and all knowledge associated with the cup into a new object. So we realized this can be done by thinking about location spaces. The two objects, the cup and the logo, have their own location spaces. I've labeled 3 points or 3 locations on the cup, A, B, and C, and I've labeled 3 locations on the logo, X, Y, and Z. And when the logo is positioned relative to the cup, they're in this case, if I move the logo on top of the cup, then A and X are physically the same location, meaning point A on the cup space is physically the same location as point or location X on the logo space. The same is true with B and Y and C and Y. So those blue arrows, in some sense, represent it's like a transform, a way of saying if I can go between the points in the space of the cup and the points in the space of the logo, I can define where the logo is on the cup or define a new object. And so every point in the logo and every point in the cup, there's a one-to-one correspondence between those two. So basically, there's one sort of blue arrow, one sort of transform that can represent this new object. And how can that be done? We are proposing a new type of cell to do this. And we call it displacement cells that solve this problem. It's a fundamental problem. It has to be solved by the cortex. Here I'm going to illustrate a little bit about how displacement cells work, just to give you a flavor for it. Now what I'm showing here are 3 grid cell modules. These are the actual, imagine these little rectangles are actually populations of neurons in your columns, in your cortex. And I'm showing at one time, the green dot represents which cell is active. That's just representing an active cell in module 1, and another active cell in module 2, and another active cell in the third module N. And let's say that those 3 active or those N active cells represent location A on the cup. That's how locations are represented in grid cells. Location A on the cup. Now, in the next moment, let's say I represent, the same grid cells can represent location X on the logo. Now, X on the logo it's a different location space. It's the same physical space when the logo is on the cup, but because it's representing in the location space of the logo, the same physical space is 2 different representations, A and X. So now I've switched from one representation at one moment in time to another representation at another moment in time, but they're physically the same location in space. The active grid cells in each of these models changed. And it's represented by the blue arrows here from the previous active one to the new active one. And if we can represent that transition, then we have a way of representing the entire position of the cup to the logo. So we're proposing that there's another set of cells called displacement cells that are also in modules. They work very similar to grid cells, but what they do is they represent the transition from one point in the other to another point in the other. And I'm just going to state this without any further justification. That if I look at the active displacement cells across a set of modules, is very unique. It is unique to the logo on the cup at a particular position. That is even as small as 20 active cells can represent the entire logo in the entire cup at a particular position. It's a very efficient representation, and it allows us to go back and forth between cup space and logo space, this displacement cell representation. So what we think is going on is that these displacement cells are on a different layer in each cortical column, in one of the cell types in layer 5. And so we have this displacement cell modules and we have grid cell modules, and this allows each cortical column to build complex models of objects composed of other objects. And we talk about how these interact in the paper that we just released a few days ago. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is object behaviors. And I mentioned earlier, objects have lots of behaviors. Doors open, but take like a smartphone, for example. It's an object, but what's on the displays changes continually. As I touch it and manipulate it, it's changing. It has behaviors. So we have to be able to represent this in cortical tissue. The neocortex has to learn these behaviors, whether it's a door opening or the behaviors of your cell phone as you're manipulating it. So we use a simple example here of a stapler. A stapler has a set of behaviors, meaning it changes its morphology or its shape, and it does various things. I'm just illustrating one of them here, which is when you can take the top of the stapler and rotate it up and open. Now, think about the stapler as similar to the coffee cup. The top of the stapler could be considered like the logo relative to the entire stapler, which is like the coffee cup. And so the top of the stapler has a position relative to the entire stapler. And so when it's closed, I'll call that displacement A, and when it's open, I'll call it displacement N. It's as if the coffee cup example earlier, I was moving the logo, but in that case it was fixed. In this case, part of the object moves relative to the other part of the object, and therefore the displacement changes. To learn this behavior, I just need to learn a sequence of those displacement cells, how they're changing over time, and then I will learn this behavior. We have previously proposed a detailed model how sequence memory is learned in the cortex. That was a 2016 paper. It would apply directly to this problem. So object behaviors can be represented and learned as sequences of displacements. And it's a very powerful mechanism, and it's a very efficient mechanism for doing that, and it has to be solved by the neocortex. I'm going to go on to one more topic that's impacted by this theory, and I'm going to go back to the hierarchy. I mentioned earlier sort of this classic view of how people think how information flows in the cortical hierarchy. And this framework suggests a new interpretation of that. You still have the same sort of regions connected together as we saw before, but now we're saying that these regions are divided into columns, and each column is learning complete models of objects. So if I observe a coffee cup in this case, there are models of the coffee cup in the visual cortex, and there's models of the coffee cup in the somatosensory or touch cortex at different levels and in different columns. These are all running in parallel. They're not identical because each model is built on the specific inputs to that column. So even in the visual cortex, there might be models that are biased towards color, some are biased towards motion, some are biased towards shape, and so on, or some would be different parts of the retina, but they're all modeling the same thing. And so we call this the thousand brains theory of intelligence. And now, if you realize, once you have all these models running all over the place in the cortex, that connections that are not hierarchical make sense. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, if any two columns are modeling the same object, then it makes sense to have long-range connections between them because they can vote. So even primary sensory visual cortex can send signals over to primary somatosensory cortex saying, look, we're both observing the same thing here, and let's vote on what that is. This solves what I call many people call the sensor fusion problem. The sensor fusion problem is as follows. People say, look, the input's coming from your sensors, and they go into the brain, and they're divided. They're all over the place. There's different parts of the visual regions, different parts of the somatosensory. Where do they get combined into a single model, a single perception of the world? And what the thousand brains theory of intelligence says, there isn't a single model of the world. There are thousands of them, but they crystallize together through this voting across long-range projections. And so there isn't a fuse, it's a distributed sensor fusion solution. You have distributed models that all vote together to create a common perception, but the models are separate. It's a very different way of looking about the brain than most people think about it today. Now let's see how we did. Francis Crick argued that we need new ways of thinking about the brain, and we need a broad framework on which to interpret experimental results. I'm proposing new ways of thinking about the brain today and a broad framework. What are the two major components of this? You can look at the level of the cortical column, and we look at the level of the cortex as a whole. So this is a review. At the cortical column, we're arguing they are far, far more powerful than currently believed. That every column is learning complex models of objects and their composition. So columns learn complete models of objects, including sub-objects and behaviors. And that grid cells and displacement cells are part of this model, and they define location spaces for objects and their relative positions. And so this is the way of thinking about how the cortex learns and manipulates objects in the world. The second thing is the neocortex as a whole. We propose that neocortex is composed of thousands of models. Those models differ based on their inputs, which is what MalCastle said back a long time ago. He said the regions were basically doing the same thing, and he said even in the common algorithms in neocortex of the column, and we're saying he's right. The column it's far more powerful than anyone thought. And that these long-range connections allow the columns to vote. So all of a sudden we have a different interpretation of the cortical hierarchy. It's not that there isn't hierarchical processing, but most of the connections in the neocortex do not fit in that hierarchy. They fit in this sort of voting scheme that goes across modalities and across columns. All right. The title of my talk refers to the framework for both intelligence and cortical function. What can we say about intelligence in here? We've been talking about how to model objects, such as coffee cups and staplers and doors and computers and things like that. Well, the first thing to remember is that this basic circuitry, this column of circuitry which would have grid cells and displacement cells, appears to be everywhere in the cortex, in the regions that do with language and the regions that do with high-level thought. And so just on the surface and following MalCastle's proposal, that everything we do is going to be based on the same principles. And we don't really understand all that yet. But the evidence suggests that's the case. But we can start thinking about it a little bit. Think about language. One of the things that displacement cells let you do is it lets you learn compositional structures, but it can also let you learn reentrant structures. So I could have an object composed of an object, which is composed of the same object, and so on. And these are the kind of structures that linguists use when we think about language. Nested structures and reentrancy and so on. All that can be supported in this model. So there's a long way to go here to understand this, but the evidence suggests very strongly that everything we think about in sort of high-level thinking can be understood in this basic framework. There is a lot of experimental support for this framework that I proposed today, and I'm not going to go through all the details here. I'm just going to give you sort of the basic categories. There is evidence that there is object-centric locations signal available in sensory regions. This is surprising, but people found that certain cells in the primary centric cortex, whether it's in V1 or V2, seem to know where they are on objects in the world, and they fire differentially. There's evidence now that there are actual grid cells in the neocortex. Some of this has done very surprising studies using fMRI, when they say, look, it looks really clear that there are grid cells in the neocortex, although not clear what they're doing there. We're proposing what that is. And also that's been observed in single-cell recordings now in humans. There's evidence that prediction in the sensory regions is based on movement, sensory motor prediction. And there's even evidence that the neocortex evolved from older parts of the brain, such as the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. So this complex machinery that might have been evolved first for understanding where we are in the world now is being used in mammals and humans to model the world as a whole. All right, now let's get to the last part of my talk, which is the implications. This will be fairly short. I won't go into too much detail. Clearly, there's a lot of implications for neuroscience. There's a tremendous amount of neuroscience data, which today is unassimilated into any kind of theoretical framework. And this, all of a sudden, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, there's a lot of experimental data which didn't really kind of make sense, which kind of now it does make sense in the neuroscience world. So it's my hope that these sort of top-down theories really will influence our understanding of experimental neuroscience. It also should provide a theoretical foundation for things. After my book came out, I was approached by some scientists at Stanford University who study pedagogy. And they informed me, they made it really clear to me that, we teach kids how to learn, but we really have no idea what's going on in their brains. And if we understood what knowledge, how it was really represented in the brain, we might be able to do better jobs at teaching people. And I was struck by that. And I think all of a sudden now we have an ability to start thinking about things like this. Also, how we form beliefs and when do we form false beliefs is a big problem for humans. We also might be able to start understanding what the limits to human intelligence are, right? Today we don't really know what those are. And finally, you can have some of the diseases of the mind could be perhaps understood, a theoretical foundation for them. How does a healthy brain do something would help us understand how it might be diseased. I think some of the biggest impacts are going to be on artificial intelligence and robotics. Now let me just step up and talk about a few things here. A lot of people talk about artificial general intelligence or true AI and so on. Most people today believe that the current AI models are very limited and we need something else. I'm going to argue the following. When ultimately we go out in the future and we talk about intelligent machines, they're going to have some of the things I've talked about here. They're going to be based on distributed models, which we call the thousand brains theory of intelligence. It's not one big monolithic model, which they're building today, but thousands of models distributed. Each of those models is going to be built using object-centric locations and location spaces. I don't think you can get away from that. You cannot learn the structure of the world without knowing the locations of things in the world. And today's neural networks don't do that. They're going to have to be designed to understand compositional structure, how objects are composed of objects. Today they don't do that. And they're going to be based on learning through movement. We learn through movement. That's how we have to move my finger over a cup to learn what it is. And today's AI doesn't do that. This says, of course, that then we have to have embodiment. You can't have an AI system that doesn't have the ability to move its sensors. And so AI and robotics are really not separate problems. They are really the same problem. And today we view them as separate problems. That's not going to be true in the future. There are some things that true AI does not have to do the same as a human. Obviously, we can make brains that are faster and larger or even smaller. We can use very different types of sensors. We don't have to use the sensors that humans have. And we can have new types of embodiments. We don't have to think about these as being like humanoid robots. And including virtual environments, virtual embodiments, excuse me. So it's possible to have an AI that its movements are moving through the internet or following links and so on. Basically, it says, I'm moving my sensor to send something else. And it doesn't have to be physical. It could be virtual. Okay. Having said that, what are some of the big impacts I think going forward here? And I think this is going to be a huge impact on humanity in the not too distant future. First of all, we can build purpose-built brains. For example, we could build a brain for mathematics or one for physics. Einstein's brain was very much like your and mine. It was just slightly different. And maybe it was a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. We don't really know. But the point is, it wasn't built on different principles. And so we should be able to build brains that are really tuned for certain types of problems. They never get tired, and they're really good at them. We can build virtual brains, as I mentioned, for example, cybersecurity. They're roaming the internet looking for things and trying to solve problems. And then there's the real big impact, I think, on humanity that will be what I call real robotics. Today's robotics are really in the dark ages. We're sort of in the stone ages with robotics. But, fluid, smart systems that act independently. And that could be used for industry. But I think also there's going to be a sort of a larger human effort here. There's a lot of people today who want to live on Mars or populate other planets or explore space. I don't think we can achieve this without having really smart robots. Engineers, scientists, things on their own, go autonomously, go out there and prepare some place on Mars for us to live. It's just not going to happen until we do that. That's my opinion. And this will allow us to really sort of branch out of our Earth in some sense. I should mention here that all the resources that I've talked about you can find on Numenta.com, the papers, and there's even a companion paper which is sort of a layperson's interpretation of all the stuff I just talked about. So you can find that there and videos and other great resources. I'm going to end now with a few just personal comments. I just wanted to come back to a couple things I talked about. One is this whole theory, this framework, in hindsight, it seems like it should have been obvious. Why do I say that? As we look out upon the world, everything has, I perceive you or people or doors or objects out here, they all have some location relative to me. They're out there. I do not perceive them on my retina where the light enters my head. I don't perceive them inside of my head. I perceive them out there. And as I said earlier, everything you perceive is basically based on a set of neuron firings. So for me to perceive something at a distance, there have to be neurons that represent that thing at a distance. And when I see two objects, I immediately see the relationship between them. I know how far apart they are. That has to be represented by neurons too, and that's what we argue is the displacement cells. So these things, in hindsight, it's obvious that these representations, our entire perception of the world is based on locations and relative positions of things. And so this is basically the language and the data types of the neocortex. It should have been obvious. But it wasn't, not to us at least. The second thing I want to go back to is what I just mentioned a moment ago, is how, at the beginning of the talk, how important understanding how the human brain works is. This is, in my mind, the most important scientific endeavor of all time. I think it's actually going to be essential to understand how our brains work for the long-term survival of our species. And this is something we should all be concerned about, and we should all be working hard to understand. And we should be thinking about the long-term implications, good and bad, about these things. I believe that we've made some significant progress in this direction, and I talked about that in this talk, and it's in the papers. I encourage you to go, if you're interested in this stuff, and many people are, to try to understand this material. I think it's important for us as a species. All right, I want to end with just a picture of the Numenta team. Here is all the people who were working at Numenta this summer on the left there. My 5 collaborators on this particular research. Subhatai Ahmad, I want to call out because he's been my long-term partner in all this stuff and helped me write this paper. Marcus Lewis was the guy who came up with the displacement cell idea, so kudos to Marcus on that. And with that, I'm done. Thank you for your time and listening to this.